The Expedition of Humphry Clinker. By Tobias Smollett. To Dr. Lewis. Dear Lewis, the deceitful calm was of short duration. I am plunged again in a sea of vexation, and the complaints in my stomach and bowels are returned, so that I suppose I shall be disabled from prosecuting the excursion I had planned. What the devil had I to do, to come a plague hunting with a leash of females in my train? Yesterday my precious sister, who, by the by, has been for some time a professed Methodist, came into my apartment, attended by Mr. Barton, and desired an audience with a very stately air. Brother, said she, this gentleman has something to propose, which I flatter myself will be the more acceptable, as it will rid you of a troublesome companion. Then Mr. Barton proceeded to this effect: I am, indeed, extremely ambitious of being allied to your family, Mr. Bramble, and I hope you will see no cause to interpose your authority. As for authority, said Tabby, interrupting him with some warmth, I know of none that he has a right to use on this occasion. If I pay him the compliment of making him acquainted with the step I intend to take, it is all he can expect in reason. This is as much as I believe he would do by me, if he intended to change his own situation in life. In a word, brother, I am so sensible of Mr. Barton's extraordinary merit, that I have been prevailed upon to alter my resolution of living a single life, and to put my happiness in his hands, by vesting him with a legal title to my person and fortune, such as they are. The business at present is to have the writings drawn, and I shall be obliged to you, if you will recommend a lawyer to me for that purpose. You may guess what an effect this overture had upon me, who, from the information of my nephew, expected that Barton was to make a formal declaration of his passion for Liddy. I could not help gazing in silent astonishment, alternately at Tabby, and her supposed admirer, who last hung his head in the most awkward confusion for a few minutes, and then retired on pretence of being suddenly seized with a vertigo. Mrs. Tabitha affected much concern, and would have had him make use of a bed in the house, but he insisted upon going home, that he might have recourse of some drops, which he kept for such emergencies, and his inamorata acquiesced. In the meantime I was exceedingly puzzled at this adventure, though I suspected the truth, and did not know in what manner to demean myself towards Mrs. Tabitha, when Jery came in and told me, he had just seen Mr. Barton alight from his chariot at Lady Griskin's door. This incident seemed to threaten a visit from her ladyship, with which we were honoured accordingly. In less than half an hour, I find, said she, there has been a match of cross purposes among you good folks, and I'm come to set you to rights. So, saying, she presented me with the following billet: Dear Sir, I no sooner recollected myself from the extreme confusion I was thrown into, by that unlucky mistake of your sister, than I thought it my duty to assure you, that my devoirs to Mrs. Bramble never exceeded the bounds of ordinary civility, and that my heart is unalterably fixed upon Miss Lydia Melford, as I had the honour to declare to her brother, when he questioned me upon that subject. Lady Griskin has been so good as to charge herself, not only with the delivery of this note, but also with the task of undeceiving Mrs. Bramble, for whom I have the most profound respect and veneration, though my affection being otherwise engaged is no longer in the power of, Sir, your very humble servant, Ralph Barton. Having cast my eyes over this billet, I told her ladyship, that I would no longer retard the friendly office she had undertaken, and I and Jery forthwith retired into another room. There we soon perceived the conversation grow very warm betwixt the two ladies, and, at length, could distinctly hear certain terms of altercation, which we could no longer delay interrupting, with any regard to decorum. When we entered the scene of contention, we found Liddy had joined the disputants, and stood trembling betwixt them, as if she had been afraid they would have proceeded to something more practical than words. Lady Griskin's face was like the full moon in a storm of wind, glaring, fiery, and portentous, while Tabby looked grim and ghastly, with an aspect breathing discord and dismay. Our appearance put a stop to their mutual revilings, but her ladyship turning to me, cousin, said she, I can't help saying I have met with a very ungrateful return from this lady, for the pains I have taken to serve her family. My family is much obliged to your ladyship," cried Tabby, with a kind of hysterical giggle, "but we have no right to the good offices of such an honourable go-between." "But, for all that, good Mrs. Tabitha Bramble," resumed the other, "I shall be content with the reflection, that virtue is its own reward, and it shall not be my fault, if you continue to make yourself ridiculous. Mr. Bramble, who has no little interest of his own to serve, will, no doubt, contribute all in his power to promote a match betwixt Mr. Barton and his niece, which will be equally honourable and advantageous, and, I dare say, Miss Liddy herself will have no objection to a measure so well calculated to make her happy in life." "I beg your ladyship's pardon," exclaimed Liddy, with great vivacity, "I have nothing but misery to expect from such a measure, and I hope my guardians will have too much compassion, to barter my peace of mind for any consideration of interest or fortune. Upon my word, Miss Liddy," said she, "you have profited by the example of your good aunt. I comprehend your meaning, and will explain it when I have a proper opportunity. In the meantime, I shall take my leave, madam, your most obedient and devoted humble servant," said she, advancing close up to my sister, and curtsying so low, that I thought she intended to squat herself down on the floor. This salutation Tabby returned with equal solemnity, and the expression of the two faces, while they continued in this attitude, would be no bad subject for a pencil like that of the incomparable Hogarth, if any such should ever appear again, in these times of dullness and degeneracy. Jery accompanied her ladyship to her house, that he might have an opportunity to restore the étoiles to Barton, and advise him to give up his suit, which was so disagreeable to his sister, against whom, however, he returned much irritated. Lady Griskin had assured him that Liddy's heart was preoccupied, and immediately the idea of Wilson recurring to his imagination, his family pride took the alarm. He denounced vengeance against the adventurer, and was disposed to be very peremptory with his sister, but I desired he would suppress his resentment, until I should have talked with her in private. The poor girl, when I earnestly pressed her on this head, owned with a flood of tears, that Wilson had actually come to the hot well at Bristol, and even introduced himself into our lodgings as a Jew pedlar, but that nothing had passed betwixt them, further than her begging him to withdraw immediately, if he had any regard for her peace of mind, that he had disappeared. Accordingly, after having attempted to prevail upon my sister's maid, to deliver a letter, which, however, she refused to receive, though she had consented to carry a message, importing that he was a gentleman of a good family, and that, in a very little time, he would avow his passion in that character, she confessed, that although he had not kept his word in this particular, he was not yet altogether indifferent to her affection, but solemnly promised she would never carry on any correspondence with him, or any other admirer, for the future, without the privity and approbation of her brother and me. By this declaration, she made her own peace with Jery, but the hot-headed boy is more than ever incensed against Wilson, whom he now considers as an impostor, that harbours some infamous design upon the honour of his family. As for Barton, he was not a little mortified to find his present returned, and his addresses so unfavourably received, but he is not a man to be deeply affected by such disappointments, and I know not whether he is not as well pleased with being discarded by Liddy, as he would have been with a permission to prosecute his pretensions, at the risk of being every day exposed to the revenge or machinations of Tabby, who is not to be slighted with impunity. I had not much time to moralize on these occurrences, for the house was visited by a constable and his gang, with a warrant from Justice Buzzard, to search the box of Humphry Clinker, my footman, who was just apprehended as a highwayman. This incident threw the whole family into confusion. My sister scolded the constable for presuming to enter the lodgings of a gentleman on such an errand, without having first asked and obtained permission. Her maid was frightened into fits, and Liddy shed tears of compassion for the unfortunate Clinker, in whose box, however, nothing was found to confirm the suspicion of robbery. For my own part, I made no doubt of the fellow's being mistaken for some other person, and I went directly to the justice, in order to procure his discharge, but there I found the matter much more serious than I expected. Poor Clinker stood trembling at the bar, surrounded by thief-takers, and at a little distance, a thick, squat fellow, a postilion, his accuser, who had seized him on the street, and swore positively to his person, that the said Clinker had, on the 15th day of March last, on Blackheath, robbed a gentleman in a post-chaise, which he, the postilion, drove. This deposition was sufficient to justify his commitment, and he was sent accordingly to Clerkenwell Prison, whither Jery accompanied him in the coach, in order to recommend him properly to the keeper, that he may want for no convenience which the place affords. The spectators, who assembled to see this highwayman, were sagacious enough to discern something very villainous in his aspect, which, begging their pardon, is the very picture of simplicity, and the justice himself put a very unfavorable construction upon some of his answers, which, he said, savored of the ambiguity and equivocation of an old offender, but, in my opinion, it would have been more just and humane to impute them to the confusion into which we may suppose a poor country lad to be thrown on such an occasion. I am still persuaded he is innocent, and, in this persuasion, I can do no less than use my utmost endeavors that he may not be oppressed. I shall, tomorrow, send my nephew to wait on the gentleman who was robbed, and beg he will have the humanity to go and see the prisoner, that, in case he should find him quite different from the person of the highwayman, he may bear testimony in his behalf. Howsoever it may fare with Clinker, this cursed affair will be to me productive of intolerable chagrin. I have already caught a dreadful cold, by rushing into the open air from the justice's parlour, where I had been stewing in the crowd, and though I should not be laid up with the gout, as I believe I shall, I must stay at London for some weeks, till this poor devil comes to his trial at Rochester, so that, in all probability, my northern expedition is blown up. If you can find anything in your philosophical budget, to console me in the midst of these distresses and apprehensions, pray let it be communicated to your unfortunate friend, Matt. Bramble, London. To Sir Watkin Phillips, of Jesus College, Oxon. Dear Wat, the farce is finished, and another piece of a graver cast brought upon the stage. Our aunt made a desperate attack upon Barton, who had no other way of saving himself, but by leaving her in possession of the field, and avowing his pretensions to Liddy, by whom he has been rejected in his turn. Lady Griskin acted as his advocate and agent on this occasion, with such zeal as embroiled her with Mrs. Tabitha, and a high scene of altercation passed betwixt these two religionists, which might have come to action, had not my uncle interposed. They are however reconciled, in consequence of an event which hath involved us all in trouble and disquiet. You must know, the poor preacher, Humphry Clinker, is now exercising his ministry among the felons in Clerkenwell Prison. A postilion having sworn a robbery against him, no bail could be taken, and he was committed to jail, notwithstanding all the remonstrances and interest my uncle could make in his behalf. All things considered, the poor fellow cannot possibly be guilty, and yet, I believe, he runs some risk of being hanged. Upon his examination, he answered with such hesitation and reserve as persuaded most of the people, who crowded the place, that he was really a knave, and the justice's remarks confirm their opinion. Exclusive of my uncle and myself, there was only one person who seemed inclined to favor the culprit. He was a young man, well dressed, and, from the manner in which he cross-examined the evidence, we took it for granted that he was a student in one of the Inns of Court. He freely checked the justice for some uncharitable inferences he made to the prejudice of the prisoner, and even ventured to dispute with his worship on certain points of law. My uncle, provoked at the unconnected and dubious answers of Clinker, who seemed in danger of falling a sacrifice to his own simplicity, exclaimed, "In the name of God, if you are innocent, say so." "No," cried he, "God forbid that I should call myself innocent, while my conscience is burthened with sin." "What then, "You did commit this robbery?" resumed his master. "No, sure," said he, "blessed be the Lord, I'm free of that guilt." Here the justice interposed, observing that the man seemed inclined to make a discovery by turning King's evidence, and desired the clerk to take his confession, upon which Humphry declared that he looked upon confession to be a popish fraud, invented by the whore of Babylon. The Templar affirmed that the poor fellow was non compos, and exhorted the justice to discharge him as a lunatic. "You know very well," added he, "that the robbery in question was not committed by the prisoner." The thief-takers grinned at one another, and Mr. Justice Buzzard replied with great emotion, "Mr. Martin, I desire you will mind your own business. I shall convince you one of these days that I understand mine." In short, there was no remedy, the mitmus was made out, and poor Clinker sent to prison in a hackney coach, guarded by the constable, and accompanied by your humble servant. By the way, I was not a little surprised to hear this retainer to justice bid the prisoner to keep up his spirits, for that he did not at all doubt but that he would get off for a few weeks' confinement. He said, his worship knew very well that Clinker was innocent of the fact, and that the real highwayman who robbed the chaise was no other than that very individual Mr. Martin, who had pleaded so strenuously for honest Humphry. Confounded at this information, I asked, why then is he suffered to go about at his liberty, and this poor innocent fellow treated as a malefactor? "We have exact intelligence of all Mr. Martin's transactions," said he, "but as yet there is not evidence sufficient for his conviction, and as for this young man, the justice could do no less than commit him, as the postilion swore point blank to his identity. So if this rascally postilion should persist in the falsity to which he is sworn," said I, "this innocent lad may be brought to the gallows." The constable observed that he would have time enough to prepare for his trial, and might prove an alibi, or, perhaps, Martin might be apprehended and convicted for another fact, in which case, he might be prevailed upon to take this affair upon himself, or, finally, if these chances should fail, and the evidence stand good against Clinker, the jury might recommend him to mercy, in consideration of his youth, especially if this should appear to be the first fact of which he had been guilty. Humphry owned he could not pretend to recollect where he had been on the day when the robbery was committed, much less prove a circumstance of that kind so far back as 6 months, though he knew he had been sick of the fever and ague, which, however, did not prevent him from going about. Then, turning up his eyes, he ejaculated, "The Lord's will be done. If it be my fate to suffer, I hope I shall not disgrace the faith of which, though unworthy, I make profession." When I expressed my surprise that the accuser should persist in charging Clinker, without taking the least notice of the real robber who stood before him, and to whom, indeed, Humphry bore not the smallest resemblance, the constable, who was himself a thief-taker, gave me to understand that Mr. Martin was the best qualified for business of all the gentlemen on the road he had ever known, that he had always acted on his own bottom, without partner or correspondent, and never went to work but when he was cool and sober, that his courage and presence of mind never failed him, that his address was genteel, and his behavior void of all cruelty and insolence, that he never encumbered himself with watches or trinkets, nor even with bank notes, but always dealt for ready money, and that in the current coin of the kingdom, and that he could disguise himself and his horse in such a manner, that, after the action, it was impossible to recognize either the one or the other. "This great man," said he, "has reigned paramount in all the roads within 50 miles of London above 15 months, and has done more business in that time than all the rest of the profession put together, for those who pass through his hands are so delicately dealt with, that they have no desire to give him the least disturbance, but for all that, his race is almost run, he is now fluttering about justice, like a moth about a candle. There are so many limette wigs laid in his way, that I'll bet a cool 100, he swings before Christmas. Shall I own to you, that this portrait, drawn by a ruffian, heightened by what I myself had observed in his deportment, has interested me warmly in the fate of poor Martin, whom nature seems to have intended for a useful and honorable member of that community upon which he now preys for subsistence. It seems, he lived some time as a clerk to a timber merchant, whose daughter Martin, having privately married, was discarded, and his wife turned out of doors. She did not long survive her marriage, and Martin, turning fortune hunter, could not supply his occasions any other way than by taking to the road, in which he has travelled hitherto with uncommon success. He pays his respects regularly to Mr. Justice Buzzard, the thief-catcher general of this metropolis, and sometimes they smoke a pipe together very lovingly, when the conversation generally turns upon the nature of evidence. The justice has given him fair warning to take care of himself, and he has received his caution in good part. Hitherto he has baffled all the vigilance, art, and activity of Buzzard and his emissaries, with such conduct as would have done honor to the genius of a Caesar or a Huron, but he has one weakness, which has proved fatal to all the heroes of his tribe, namely, an indiscreet devotion to the fair sex, and in all probability, he will be attacked on this defenseless quarter. Be that as it may, I saw the body of poor Clinker consigned to the jailer of Clerkenwell, to whose indulgence I recommended him so effectually, that he received him in the most hospitable manner, though there was a necessity for equipping him with a suit of irons, in which he made a very rueful appearance. The poor creature seemed as much affected by my uncle's kindness, as by his own misfortune. When I assured him that nothing should be left undone for procuring his enlargement, and making his confinement easy in the meantime, he fell down on his knees, and kissing my hand, which he bathed with his tears, Squire, cried he, sobbing, "What shall I say? I can't, no, I can't speak. My poor heart is bursting with gratitude to you and my dear, generous, noble benefactor. I protest, the scene became so pathetic, that I was faint to force myself away, and return to my uncle, who sent me in the afternoon with a compliment to one Mr. Mead, the person who had been robbed on Blackheath. As I did not find him at home, I left a message, in consequence of which he called at our lodgings this morning, and very humanely agreed to visit the prisoner. By this time, Lady Griskin had come to make her formal compliments of condolence to Mrs. Tabitha, on this domestic calamity, and that prudent maiden, whose passion was now cooled, thought proper to receive her ladyship so civilly, that a reconciliation immediately ensued. These two ladies resolved to comfort the poor prisoner in their own persons, and Mr. Mead and I squired them to Clerkenwell, my uncle being detained at home by some slight complaints in his stomach and bowels. The turnkey, who received us at Clerkenwell, looked remarkably sullen, and when we inquired for Clinker, "I don't care, if the devil had him," said he, "here has been nothing but canting and praying since the fellow entered the place. Rabbit him, the tap will be ruined, we ha'n't sold a cask of beer, nor a dozen of wine, since he paid his garnish. The gentlemen get drunk with nothing but your damned religion. For my part, I believe as how your man deals with the devil. 2 or 3 as bold hearts as ever took the air upon Hounslow have been blubbering all night, and if the fellow ain't speedily removed by habeas corpus, or otherwise, I'll be damned if there's a grain of true spirit left within these walls. We shan't have a soul to do credit to the place, or make his exit like a true-born Englishman. Damn my eyes! There will be nothing but snivelling in the cart. We shall all die like so many psalm-singing weavers." In short, we found that Humphrey was at that very instant, haranguing the felons in the chapel, and that the jailer's wife and daughter, together with my aunt's woman, Win Jenkins, and our housemaid, were among the audience, which we immediately joined. I never saw anything so strongly picturesque as this congregation of felons clanking their chains, in the midst of whom stood Orator Clinker, expatiating in a transport of fervor, on the torments of hell, denounced in Scripture against evildoers, comprehending murderers, robbers, thieves, and whoremongers. The variety of attention exhibited in the faces of those ragamuffins, formed a group that would not have disgraced the pencil of a Raphael. In one, it denoted admiration; in another, doubt; in a third, disdain; in a fourth, contempt, in a fifth, terror, in a sixth, derision, and in a seventh, indignation. As for Mrs. Winifred Jenkins, she was in tears, overwhelmed with sorrow, but whether for her own sins, or the misfortune of Clinker, I cannot pretend to say. The other females seemed to listen with a mixture of wonder and devotion. The jailer's wife declared he was a saint in trouble, saying, she wished from her heart there was such another good soul, like him, in every jail in England. Mr. Mead, having earnestly surveyed the preacher, declared his appearance was so different from that of the person who robbed him on Blackheath, that he could freely make oath he was not the man, but Humphry himself was by this time pretty well rid of all apprehensions of being hanged, for he had been the night before solemnly tried and acquitted by his fellow prisoners, some of whom he had already converted to Methodism. He now made proper acknowledgments for the honor of our visit, and was permitted to kiss the hands of the ladies, who assured him he might depend upon their friendship and protection. Lady Griskin, in her great zeal, exhorted his fellow prisoners to profit by the precious opportunity of having such a saint in bonds among them, and turn over a new leaf for the benefit of their poor souls, and, that her admonition might have the greater effect, she reinforced it with her bounty. While she and Mrs. Tabby returned in the coach with the two maid-servants, I waited on Mr. Mead to the house of Justice Buzzard, who, having heard his declaration, said his oath could be of no use at present, but that he would be a material evidence for the prisoner at his trial, so that there seems to be no remedy but patience for poor Clinker, and, indeed, the same virtue, or medicine, will be necessary for us all, the squire in particular, who had set his heart upon his excursion to the northward. While we were visiting honest Humphry in Clerkenwell prison, my uncle received a much more extraordinary visit at his own lodgings. Mr. Martin, of whom I have made such honorable mention, desired permission to pay him his respects, and was admitted accordingly. He told him, that having observed him, at Mr. Buzzard's, a good deal disturbed by what had happened to his servant, he had come to assure him he had nothing to apprehend for Clinker's life, for, if it was possible that any jury could find him guilty upon such evidence, he, Martin himself, would produce in court a person, whose deposition would bring him off, clear as the sun at noon. Sure, the fellow would not be so romantic as to take the robbery upon himself! He said, the postilion was an infamous fellow, who had been a dabbler in the same profession, and saved his life at the Old Bailey by impeaching his companions, that being now reduced to great poverty, he had made this desperate push, to swear away the life of an innocent man, in hopes of having the reward upon his conviction, but that he would find himself miserably disappointed, for the justice and his myrmidons were determined to admit of no interloper in this branch of business, and that he did not at all doubt but that they would find matter enough to shop the evidence himself before the next jail delivery. He affirmed that all these circumstances were well known to the justice, and that his severity to Clinker was no other than a hint to his master to make him a present in private, as an acknowledgment of his candour and humanity. This hint, however, was so unpalatable to Mr. Bramble, that he declared, with great warmth, he would rather confine himself for life to London, which he detested, than be at liberty to leave it tomorrow, in consequence of encouraging corruption in a magistrate. Hearing, however, how favourable Mr. Mead's report had been for the prisoner, he is resolved to take the advice of counsel in what manner to proceed for his immediate enlargement. I make no doubt, but that in a day or two this troublesome business may be discussed, and in this hope we are preparing for our journey. If our endeavours do not miscarry, we shall have taken the field before you hear again from yours, J. Mel. To Dr. Lewis. Thank heaven. Dear Lewis, the clouds are dispersed, and I have now the clearest prospect of my summer campaign, which, I hope, I shall be able to begin tomorrow. I took the advice of counsel with respect to the case of Clinker, in whose favour a lucky incident has intervened. The fellow who accused him has had his own battery turned upon himself. 2 days ago he was apprehended for a robbery on the highway, and committed, on the evidence of an accomplice. Clinker, having moved for a writ of habeas corpus, was brought before the Lord Chief Justice, who, in consequence of an affidavit of the gentleman who had been robbed, importing that the said Clinker was not the person who stopped him on the highway, as well as in consideration of the postillion's character and present circumstances, was pleased to order that my servant should be admitted to bail, and he has been discharged accordingly, to the unspeakable satisfaction of our whole family, to which he has recommended himself in an extraordinary manner, not only by his obliging deportment, but by his talents of preaching, praying, and singing psalms, which he has exercised with such effect, that even Tabby respects him as a chosen vessel. If there was anything like affectation or hypocrisy in this excess of religion, I would not keep him in my service, but, so far as I can observe, the fellow's character is downright simplicity, warmed with a kind of enthusiasm, which renders him very susceptible of gratitude and attachment to his benefactors. As he is an excellent horseman, and understands farriery, I have bought a stout gelding for his use, that he may attend us on the road, and have an eye to our cattle, in case the coachman should not mind his business. My nephew, who is to ride his own saddle horse, has taken, upon trial, a servant just come from abroad with his former master, Sir William Stroleb, who vouches for his honesty. The fellow, whose name is Dutton, seems to be a petit maître. He has got a smattering of French, bows, and grins, and shrugs, and takes snuff à la mode de France, but values himself chiefly upon his skill and dexterity in hair-dressing. If I am not much deceived by appearance, he is, in all respects, the very contrast of Humphry Clinker. My sister has made up matters with Lady Griskin, though, I must own, I should not have been sorry to see that connection entirely destroyed, but Tabby is not of a disposition to forgive Barton, who, I understand, is gone to his seat in Berkshire for the summer season. I cannot help suspecting, that in the treaty of peace, which has been lately ratified betwixt those two females, it is stipulated, that her ladyship shall use her best endeavours to provide an agreeable helpmate for our sister Tabitha, who seems to be quite desperate in her matrimonial designs. Perhaps, the matchmaker is to have a valuable consideration in the way of brokerage, which she will most certainly deserve, if she can find any man in his senses, who will yoke with Mrs. Bramble from motives of affection or interest. I find my spirits and my health affect each other reciprocally, that is to say, everything that discomposes my mind, produces a correspondent disorder in my body, and my bodily complaints are remarkably mitigated by those considerations that dissipate the clouds of mental chagrin. The imprisonment of Clinker brought on those symptoms which I mentioned in my last, and now they are vanished at his discharge. It must be owned, indeed, I took some of the tincture of ginseng, prepared according to your prescription, and found it exceedingly grateful to the stomach, but the pain and sickness continued to return, after short intervals, till the anxiety of my mind was entirely removed, and then I found myself perfectly at case. We have had fair weather these 10 days, to the astonishment of the Londoners, who think it portentous. If you enjoy the same indulgence in Wales, I hope Barnes has got my hay made, and safe cocked by this time. As we shall be in motion for some weeks, I cannot expect to hear from you as usual, but I shall continue to write from every place at which we make any halt, that you may know our track, in case it should be necessary to communicate anything to your assured friend, Matt. Bramble, London, June 4. To Mrs. Mary Jones, at Brambleton Hall, N.C. Dear Mary, having the occasion of my cousin Jenkins of Abergavenny, I send you, as a token, a turkey shell comb, a kipple of yards of green ribbon, and a sarment upon the nothingness of good works, which was preached in the tabernacle, and you will also receive a horn buck for Saul, whereby she may learn her letters, for Finn much concerned about the state of her poor soul, and what are all the pursuits of this life to the concerns of that immortal part? What is life but a vale of affliction? O Mary! The whole family have been in such a constipation! Mr. Clinker has been in trouble, but the gates of hell have not been able to prevail against him. His virtue is like poor Gould, 7 times tried in the fire. He was tuck up for a robbery, and had before Gustas Bushard, who made his mit a mouse, and the poor youth was sent to prison upon the false oath of a William, that wanted to swear his life away for the lucre of Cain. The squire did all in his power, but could not prevent his being put in chains, and confined among common manufactors, where he stood like an innocent sheep in the midst of wolves and tigers. Lord knows what might have happened to this pious young man, if master had not applied to Appius Cauricus, who lives with old bailiff, and is, they say, 500 years old, God bless us, and a conjurer, but, if he be, sure I am he don't deal with the devil, otherwise he couldn't have fought out Mr. Clinker, as he did, in spite of stone walls, iron bolts, and double locks, that flew open at his command, for old Scratch has not a greater enemy upon hearth than Mr. Clinker, who is, indeed, a very powerful labourer in the Lord's vineyard. I do no more than use the words of my good lady, who has got the effectual calling, and, I trust, that even myself, though unworthy, shall find grace to be accepted. Miss Liddy has been touched to the quick, but is a little timorsome, howsomever, I make no doubt, but she, and all of us, will be brought, by the endeavours of Mr. Clinker, to produce blessed fruit of generation and repentance. As for master and the young squire, they have as yet had narrow glimpse of the new light. I doubt as how their hearts are hardened by worldly wisdom, which, as the Bible saith, is foolishness in the sight of God. O Mary Jones, pray without ceasing for grace to prepare you for the operations of this wonderful instrument, which, I hope, will be exorcised this winter upon you and others at Brambleton Hall. Tomorrow, we are to set out in a cox and four for Yorkshire, and, I believe, we shall travel that way far, and farther than I can tell, but I shan't go so far as to forget my friends, and Mary Jones will always be remembered as one of them by her humble servant, Win. Jenkins, London, June 14. To Mrs. Gwyllim, housekeeper at Brambleton Hall. Mrs. Gwyllim, I can't help thinking it very strange, that I never had an answer to the letter I wrote you some weeks ago from Bath, concerning the sour bear, the gander, and the maids eating butter, which I won't allow to be wasted. We are now going upon a long journey to the north, whereby I desire you will redouble your care and circumflexion, that, the family may be well managed in our absence, for, you know, you must render account, not only to your earthly master, but also to him that is above, and if you are found a good and faithful servant, great will be your reward in heaven. I hope there will be 20 stun of cheese ready for market, by the time I get home, and as much allspun, as will make half a dozen pair of blankets, and that the savings of the buttermilk will fetch me a good penny before Martinmas, as the 2 pigs are to be fed for baking with bitchmast and acrons. I wrote to Dr. Lewes for the same purpose, but he never had the good manners to take the least notice of my letter, for which reason, I shall never favour him with another, though he beshits me on his bended knees. You will do well to keep a watchful eye over the Hind Williams, who is one of his emissaries, and, I believe, no better than he should be at bottom. God forbid that I should lack Christian charity, but charity begins at home, and sure nothing can be a more charitable work than to rid the family of such vermin. I do suppose, that the blind old cow has been had to the parson's bull, that old Moll has had another litter of pigs, and that Dick is become a mighty mouser. Pray order everything for the best, and be frugal, and keep the maids to their labor. If I had a private opportunity, I would send them some hymns to sing instead of profane ballads, but, as I can't, they and you must be contented with the prayers of your assured friend, T. Bramble, London, June 14.